Jarrett sat in his apartment, a drink close to hand, as he set up to make his last video. He kept glancing at the corner, the pocket of darkness seeming unaffected by the studio lights he had set up. He didn't dare let his eyes linger there for too long. He might see them, and then all would be lost. They had been after him for a while now, been after him ever since she had brought that darkness into his life. Jarrett tried to push that thought away. That was the lack of sleep and too much alcohol talking. He couldn't let her change him, couldn't let her win. It had been 6 months since his career had fallen apart. He had once been a big star, the darling of YouTube, well on his way to being one of the greatest musicians of his age. Then Crystal had appeared, and they had come with her. He still remembered the first time they had met. Crystal had been dating one of the actors on Saturday Night Live when Jarrett had been their musical talent and guest host. That had been while his star was still on the rise. That had been when he could still depend on getting 3 million views on any YouTube video he put up. He had quickly found her beside him in the green room, laughing at his jokes, flirting with him shamelessly. Jarrett was used to women flirting with him, but Crystal was different. All the girls before her had been hangers-on, girls content to ride his stardom. Crystal had dreams, aspirations, and after talking with her for a few hours, Jarrett had found himself smitten. She left with him that night, and within a week, she was sharing his bed. That was the first night he'd seen them. They had fallen into bed together, her drunk and laughing, and Jarrett buzzed and singing something he'd made up to make her laugh, when their lips had come together. They hadn't separated until they had fallen into an exhausted pile of sweaty bodies. She had fallen asleep, her body warm against his, and Jarrett had reached shakily to turn off the lamp by his bed. His head had been spinning a little, still drunk off the afterglow and the beer he had had earlier, when he glanced at the corner and pulled his hand back like he'd touched a hot stove. It had been there in the corner for just a second, a grinning dark thing with no eyes and a mouth full of far too human teeth. He swiped his face with his hand, trying to make his eyes focus, and when he looked back, the thing had been gone. Jarrett slept, but he slept with the lights on that night. Now he slept with the lights on most every night. "Hey there," he said, flipping his hair out of his face as he stared blearily into the camera. It's me. I've been thinking about this song for a while now, and I think I'm finally ready to play it." He picked up his guitar and played the first note. It sounded terrible. His guitar hadn't been tuned in a very long time. It didn't matter, he supposed. Anything he played would sound amazing. Although these days, it was all amazingly depressing. His upbeat and snappy songs that were once hummed by high school kids had become dark and brooding, fit only for the back rooms of clubs and the dimly lit bedrooms of emo kids. That had always been his power, though. He played what was inside him, and he played it well. If his songs were dark, then it was a reflection of him. The tune jangled like a dying thing, but Jarrett played on regardless. Their relationship had been rocky almost from the start. Crystal liked to drink, and Jarrett didn't. Crystal liked to get high. Jarrett didn't. Crystal liked to get drunk and high and start fights with Jarrett in public places, ensuring that her face would be on the cover of the next day's tabloids. This was the sort of fame she was after. A sloppy train wreck sort of fame that made you more infamous than famous. Jarrett had grown up in a small town with a good family, and this sort of thing was new to him. He had never so much as seen his father raise his voice to his mother, and the thought that his mother might strike his father was more alien than her slitting his throat while he slept. Jarrett was in a situation he didn't understand, but he made the best of it, as best as he could. After 6 months of this, Jarrett threatened to call it off with her, but this would prove to be a pattern with them. Crystal would cry and leave, saying Jarrett didn't need her around and how much better he'd be without her, and then Jarrett would miss her, blaming himself for their troubles. Then Crystal would send him a text a few days later, and they would fall back together like puzzle pieces. Then she would repeat it a few months later, and the cycle would continue, again and again. In hindsight, it was easy to see that he'd been in an abusive relationship, but it's harder to see things like that from the inside. It's hard to tell a lot of things until you're staring at the end. As the fighting and the hurting went on, they just kept coming back. He would see them out of the corner of his eye. He would see them in the dark corners of his house. He would see them standing on the street corner as his cab drove between clubs and venues. They followed him. They wanted him. But for some reason, they didn't like to hang around while he played music. His music was upbeat, hopeful, and the little monsters didn't seem to like the sound of it. He never saw them in the places where he performed, and it was the only respite from their leering mouths that he found. As his song jangled on, though, he could see them now. They gathered in the corners of his dingy apartment. They grinned at him from the shadows of his kitchenette. As the song went on, his acoustic guitar sounded like a dying animal as he sang in a husky, whiskey-soaked voice. He saw them coming closer as he baked under the single stage light. He was tired of running. He was ready for them to catch him. She had claimed that she left him, but it had been Jarrett who finally ended it. He'd had enough of the fighting, he'd had enough of the apologies, and he'd had enough of her adding controversy to what was otherwise a drama-free life. She had come to start a fight with him, the tabloids having moved on from her last public explosion, and he put her out. He said it was over. He said they were through, and he said she needed to leave. The police had ended up being called to remove her, but she wasn't done by a long shot. His song came to a close, his guitar sounding almost glad to be done as it rattled to silence. "Thanks for listening," Jarrett said, wiping his eyes as he became aware that he'd been crying as he played. "If you're still watching, I'd like to let you know that this will be my last song. I want to thank all my fans, everyone who supported me through the years and through all the pain, but this will be it for me. Whatever spark I had is gone, and the music is just another reminder of what I've lost. Thanks for listening, and have a great life." He reached up and turned off the camera, the world not needing to witness the things that swarmed around him. His last thoughts were of Crystal, and those thoughts were filled with a blistering rage. Crystal had not gone quietly. She had come back with accusations of abuse. Jarrett had been abusive. Jarrett had been physically violent with her. She had pictures and bruises, and at the end of the day, people had believed her. Well, not believed her, but everyone loves a train wreck, don't they? The more he fought against the accusations, the more guilty it was decided that he looked. Though cleared in the court of law, he was tarnished in the court of public opinion. Crystal would go on to publish a book about her experience, write and sing her own music, and take a tour of talk shows as she told her story. Jarrett climbed into the bottle, and when he'd come out, the creatures had been his only friends. Maybe you can help me with something before I go," he said, and the little buggers stopped in their tracks. Jarrett looked at them through the swoop of his long hair, surprised. He had never talked to them before. He had never even tried to reason with them. They had hounded him for years, but maybe all he had needed to do was acknowledge them. They were now the closest thing he had to companionship. When in hell, maybe you just had to enjoy the heat. "I don't know what your plans are for me, but I'd like to take one more person along for the ride if I can. Think you can help me with that?" As they whispered in his ear, his lips splitting into a ghoulish grin, Jarrett found that they could help him. Jarrett found, in fact, that they were happy to help him. He dialed Crystal's number as a new song popped into his head. He laughed a mad laugh that sounded like tittering from an insane asylum. As the voicemail picked up, Jarrett left his last message to the world. He tried to hold in his laughs, the sound already becoming less than human, but it was hard. He could feel the cold metal biting into his palm, but he didn't think they had realized it was there yet. Maybe they didn't care either. Perhaps his death would be enough for them. One more light extinguished from the world. Jarrett sang his dirge as he rocked on the edge of the bathtub, the water a gentle chorus behind him. It was the best performance he'd ever given, the best one in years, and when it was over, he hung the phone up and let it slip from his hand. It fell into the water with a metallic snark as it died at the bottom. They stepped towards him, now a large crowd of barely contained darkness, but he smiled back at them in triumph. "Sorry, kids. Not today," he said. He whipped the razor across his arm, cutting deep as he tumbled into the bath. He heard the lead creature scream in angry humor, and suddenly the swarm was upon him. He fell into the tub, his vision obscured by the red and wavery translucence, as a tide of black pushed him down to join his cell phone. They swarmed around him, chuckling in a watery way as the liquid filled his lungs. They might end his life, but they wouldn't have him. On a baser level, he knew they meant to add him to their ranks of shadowy, smiling devils, and Jarrett wouldn't have it. He may not have been allowed to live on his own terms, but he would damn sure die on them. He died, surrounded by the laughter one hears in hell.
You're still here. I thought you might be. Thanks for joining me for tonight's story. If your insatiable appetite for horror knows no bounds, might I suggest one of our playlists, or one of our previous stories in the archive? There should be one appearing at the end of the story any minute now. And of course, if you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and hit that subscribe button? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If you prefer your horror a little more analog, you can always pick up one of my books. There's a link below to my latest, and it'll take you to all the great things that I've posted on Amazon. For my book lovers in the audience, I always suggest coming on down to Patreon so you can become part of my ghostly reader tier and get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. Speaking of my patrons, let's go ahead and thank them. Thanks to Janet for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor, and thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you're thinking you might like to become one of my patrons, follow the link below to my Patreon. And as always, however you support the show, I appreciate it. Till next time, Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.